Afternoon. I have to say that the Walton College has benefited so much from Rodolfo over the years. He is just an incredible ambassador for the college. He graduated in December of '96 from the MBA, was selected. Actually, I think he said it was the best contribution. He would be the most outstanding graduate now if we had that award. But he started the Business Graduate Students Association back then, and he came here because he did a lot of research and said, I want to go into retail. And guess where he chose to come? So it's really great. He came here, and then he worked for Walmart and got to teach. So, Rodolfo, thank you very much.
Who said Bunau-Varilla invented Panama?
It was Eric Severin.
Journalist of the last century. He won 3 Peabody Awards, the Harry S. Truman Award, Emmy Awards. He was one of 5 journalists to have his face on a postage stamp. So he was a very, very credible person. So when he wrote the article titled The Man Who Invented Panama, I was curious to see why he would say that a person had invented a country. And basically what he said was that if this character, Philippe Bunau-Varilla, had not existed, probably Panama would not exist today. Perhaps the canal would have not been built in Panama, and maybe even if the canal had been built in Panama, it would have not been by the United States, but by another country such as Germany, who at the time was very interested in completing the Panama Canal that the French had started. Another comment that he made is that, and this is 50 years ago, that very little is known about Bunau-Varilla in the United States, even though he changed this country's history and, of course, the history of Latin America. And that if you heard about him or you knew about him when you were reading that article 50 years ago, you're probably 1 in a million. So today I think that we would all agree that not very many people know about this character who was so instrumental in changing world history back then.
What is the novel about?
And the story is about how this guy, this young engineer who had just arrived in Panama, almost 20 years later, becomes ambassador of a country that he helped create.
This is Bunau-Varilla when he first arrived in Panama. He's second from left with a black derby hat. And almost 20 years later, here he is signing the Panama Canal Treaty with the Secretary of State.
So how do you explain that change? Young engineer goes to dig a canal. 20 years later, he becomes ambassador of a new country so that he can complete the Panama Canal. The person behind the project was Ferdinand de Lesseps, who had built, of course, the Suez Canal. And according to all the people at the time, the best person to build the Panama Canal would be the person who had been successful in building the Suez Canal in 1869. And as you can see from the cartoon, he is perceived as somebody really powerful and able to do incredible things. Right? So he negotiates with Colombia the right to build a canal in Panama, and then he goes to Panama to do a first exploration, and then he goes to a university or a polytechnic school in Paris to try and recruit engineers, just like he had done a decade and change before in order to build the Suez Canal. And he goes to the polytechnic school in Paris and tries to recruit new engineers. And guess who he meets while he is in the school? One of the first people in the audience. Oh, okay. There. Thanks. One of the first people that he sees in the audience is Philippe Bunau-Varilla. He was a young student. He was there on a scholarship, and he becomes obsessed with going to Panama as soon as he graduates to build the Panama Canal. And he does, and that's how he arrives at this picture that I was showing you a little while ago.
Why did the French fail to complete the Panama Canal?
I think this picture summarizes Ferdinand de Lesseps' mistakes at the time. As you can see, he's wearing an Arabic headdress in Panama, and the books tell of him wearing Arabic costumes and headdress and running around Panama, trying to replicate what worked for him in Egypt. He imported some of the techniques that had worked very well in Egypt to Panama. And as you may know, the soil in Panama is totally different from the sandy soil of Egypt. And so they're having a really hard time progressing, plus there's a lot of corruption in the company. And the first few years of the excavation, the average depth of the canal only increased by about 1 meter or 3. And another factor complicating progress was the presence of malaria and yellow fever. At the time, people did not know that those diseases are transmitted by mosquitoes. They thought that malaria and yellow fever were transmitted by the fumes or the vapors that come out of the soil when you excavate, or that they would be caused by the filth that was very common in those cities at the time. So, interesting fact, in the hospitals that where they were treating patients for malaria and yellow fever, they would put little cups of water at the foot of the patients' beds to prevent ants from biting them, from coming up and biting them. And of course, that's where mosquitoes would breed. At first, he tried to convince the French to complete the Panama Canal, but nobody was interested. Everybody had lost their money, and it was a very trying period for the country. Nobody was interested in putting more money into the Panama Canal. France, at the time, had an alliance with Russia, so he decided to go to visit the Tsar, and the Tsar wouldn't see him, but he met with Sergei Witt, who was the finance minister, who later negotiated the peace accords with President Roosevelt. And the Russians were interested, but nothing happened. The Tsar was murdered shortly afterwards. France was in a very difficult position, and it just didn't happen. And so with France unable to do anything and Russia being out of the picture, the only solution was the United States. But the United States was already committed to Nicaragua. Since 1850, the United States had several treaties to build a canal in Nicaragua, and that was the favorite place to build a canal for the United States. Again, Nicaragua was the preferred place to build a canal designed by Americans, built by Americans, and controlled by Americans. They didn't want anything to do with the French canal. And so it was a difficult order to convince the United States, the Senate, to prefer Panama other than Nicaragua. Key person was one of the first lobbyists in the United States. William Nelson Cromwell was a lawyer from New York, and he represented the Panama Canal Company. And so he worked together with Philippe in order to do the lobbying. He made a $60,000 donation to Senator Mark Hanna, who would become the biggest supporter of the Panama Canal in the Senate. Don't know if the donation was related to the support, but he was a very powerful figure at the time. He was rumored to be a potential candidate for the U.S. presidency, so he carried a lot of weight. And he used a lot of materials that Philippe had created that compared Panama and Nicaragua. And there's two things that I want to highlight in this section. One is that stamp that you see over there. It's a stamp of Nicaragua that shows a volcano. And then the statistics where Philippe was showing that Nicaragua required more digging, that was more expensive to operate, et cetera, et cetera. He had a lot of charts and an easy way to translate that Panama was, in his view, a better place to build a canal. But going back to the stamp, at the time, everybody was in favor of Nicaragua. And Philippe viewed as an opportunity to use this stamp to convince the United States that Panama was a safer place to build a canal. A few weeks before the vote, the Mount Pelée volcano in the island of Martinique had erupted and had killed over 30,000 people. So the United States at the time was very, very aware of the danger that volcanoes present. So what Philippe did is he took one of these stamps, put it on a paper with this legend, and sent it to all the senators just before the vote. And basically told them, Nicaragua is too dangerous to build the American canal, and you should select Panama. And they did. By a margin of 8 votes, the Senate elected to build in Panama, and a decades-long preference for Nicaragua was reversed.
This is the stamp that was sent to the senators.
And the Spooner Bill, which basically said, okay, we're going to let the president build the canal in in Panama, But if you cannot work things out with Colombia and the French, you need to go back to Nicaragua. So option A, Panama, for $40 million. And if you cannot make that work, you have to go back to Nicaragua. In 1903, almost after a year of the United States saying we're going to go with Panama, Colombia said we don't want to do business with the United States. We need more money. And they rejected the treaty that their ambassador had signed with the United States. And that technically put President Roosevelt in a position where he needed to go back to Nicaragua and build his canal there at a cost much higher than the $40 million. Philippe decided, okay, I have to do something different. You know, the stamp helped, the lobbying helped, convincing people helped, but I have to do something different. We have to move forward with this, and the only way to do this is to help Panama finally break away from Colombia. And so he visited President Roosevelt and asked him, will you support a revolution in Panama? And when you read Roosevelt's and Bunau-Varilla's account of the meeting, they vary very much, of course. But what did happen, and that is that a few days afterwards, Bunau-Varilla received a copy of a book on behalf of Secretary of State John Hay. So Philippe got this book, and he didn't know why he was getting the book. But there was, I don't know if it's true, in the novel I put that there was a little marking on one of the paragraphs that I'm going to show you right now. And this is what it said. If the country's president doesn't give the concession, the company will begin to look to one who will. So imagine Philippe's surprise when he asked if the government would support it. He didn't get an answer, but he got this book. And later, President Roosevelt said, well, if Philippe had not gotten the message, he would have been very dumb. So, with the exception of one man who was killed by a cannon blast from a Colombian boat, the revolution happened with no bloodshed. And shortly afterwards, Bunau-Varilla went to the Blue Room of the White House with his son to be confirmed as the first ambassador of the new country of Panama by the United States, thus enabling him to sign the Panama Canal Treaty.
This is the Panama Canal Treaty that Bunau-Varilla signed.
But the Panamanians rushed to Washington because they wanted to negotiate the Canal Treaty and sign it themselves. And they were too late. They arrived 3 or 4 hours after the treaty had been signed. And they were, it says here that they were negotiating for $50 million when the U.S. wanted to pay 40, but they weren't able to negotiate anything. It was done, and basically the threat that they received was, well, if you want to undo what's being negotiated by your ambassador, this Frenchman that you designated to be your representative, then we'll just forget about it and you can go back to Colombia. And of course, they would all be killed if they went back to Colombia because they had revolted against their own country. This cartoon from the New York Times, I think, captures the essence of the story. This is Bunau-Varilla, of course, inciting the Panama chicken to come out of the Colombia egg, and Roosevelt ready to start digging the canal and grabbing the concession that the Panama Republic is giving them.
And so the Panama Canal, and perhaps the Republic of Panama, were created in large part thanks to the involvement of Philippe Bunau-Varilla. Even though he did some questionable things in order to achieve his goals, it cannot be denied that he was a man that changed world history.
In the final chapters, fast forward to 1940, when an older Philippe Bunau-Varilla, still very wealthy, living in Paris, gets contacted by Eric Severin, who was a young war correspondent who had been given the task of finding out if he was still alive and interviewed him for Ripley's Believe It or Not. And that's it. That's the novel. I hope you enjoyed the story, and I really think that the weight of Bunau-Varilla's effects on world history shouldn't be ignored much longer. It's a really interesting story, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come this afternoon. Thank you very much.